The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. The neon sign of Luigi's Trattoria buzzed with a frantic, dying energy, casting long, erratic, and almost sickly pink shadows across the rain-slicked pavement of Chicago's West Loop. It was the kind of miserable November night where the cold seemed to seep directly into the concrete. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the comforting, aggressive scent of roasting garlic, cheap Chianti, and the low, steady hum of familiar conversation. It was a Tuesday, typically a quiet sanctuary for the neighborhood regulars seeking refuge from the chill, but tonight, a table of 4 young men, suit-clad, arrogant, and obnoxiously loud, had claimed a corner booth near the kitchen doors, entirely disrupting the usual peaceful rhythm of the old restaurant. They were out of place, exuding a jarring energy of unearned privilege that set the older patrons on edge. Eleanor Moreau methodically wiped down the worn mahogany counter, her hand steady despite the bone-deep exhaustion gnawing at her joints. She wasn't the stereotypical waitress you'd see in a glossy Hollywood movie. She was plump, comfortably soft, and possessed a quiet confidence that radiated from her. Her kind brown eyes held a sharp, observant intelligence that often went unnoticed by those who only looked surface deep. She had a master's degree in architectural history, gathering dust, a mountain of student debt that felt insurmountable, and a dying mother whose escalating medical bills were slowly but surely drowning her in anxiety. Luigi's was her 3rd job of the day, a grueling, greasy end to an already exhausting schedule that started before dawn. "Hey, sweetheart," one of the men yelled, the sound cutting through the ambient noise as he snapped his fingers with an irritating, percussive crack. He had severely slicked back hair, an expensive watch that gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, and a cruel, practiced smile. "Another round. And make it quick, yeah? We ain't got all night. We have places to be that are actually worth our time." Elena grabbed her battered serving tray, her face instantly smoothing into an unreadable professional mask. She'd learned long ago, through bitter experience, that reacting emotionally only fueled the fire of men looking for an easy target. She walked over, placing the fresh drinks down with practiced efficiency and a forced neutrality. "There you go, gentlemen. Enjoy." "Hold on a minute," the slick-haired man said, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was shockingly strong, his manicured fingers digging into her skin, and his eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "You're not very friendly, are you? It's bad for business." Elena tried to pull away smoothly, not wanting to make a scene, but he held tight, his grip tightening imperceptibly. "I'm working," she said evenly, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the nearby tables. "Please let go of my arm." "Come on, smile," another man chimed in, leaning forward with a smirk playing on his thin lips. He reeked of expensive cologne and cheap thrills. "You'd be almost pretty if you smiled." "Almost. Give it a try." The other 2 men laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed unpleasantly in the small space and made Eleanor's stomach churn with revulsion. The humiliation was palpable, thick in the air. She yanked her arm back forcefully, finally breaking his grip with a sharp jerk. "I said, let go." The slick-haired man's eyes narrowed instantly. The playful cruelty vanished, replaced by sudden, ugly, unadulterated anger. His ego had been bruised in front of his friends. "Who do you think you're talking to, you fat?" Before he could finish the hateful insult, his hand shot out with startling speed. He grabbed his half-full glass of whiskey from the table and, with a vicious flick of his wrist, threw the contents directly into Elena's face. The amber liquid hit her with stinging force. It burned her eyes, the sharp scent of cheap alcohol overwhelming her senses. Gasps erupted from the surrounding tables, the sound of silverware dropping against porcelain ringing out. The entire restaurant fell dead silent, the previous hum of conversation instantly extinguished by the sheer brutality of the act. Elena stood there for a long, agonizing moment, the whiskey dripping from her chin, soaking into the starched collar of her white uniform, leaving a dark, humiliating stain. She didn't cry. She didn't scream, though every instinct screamed at her to flee or fight back. She simply closed her stinging eyes, took a slow, agonizingly deep breath, and opened them again. The anger bubbling inside her was icy, contained, and entirely controlled. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She wiped her face slowly with a napkin she pulled from her apron, her movements deliberate and terrifyingly calm. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, lacking even a tremor. The man faltered for a second, clearly unsettled by her lack of hysterics. He had expected tears, shouting, begging. Instead, he got a wall of quiet defiance. Then he sneered, trying to recover his lost bravado. "Yeah, I'm finished. Get us the check. This place is a dump anyway." "You don't need a check," a voice said from the shadows at the back of the room. It was a quiet voice, a low baritone that didn't need volume to command absolute attention. It was the sound of authority, and it sliced through the tense silence of the restaurant like a straight razor across silk. Elena turned, blinking rapidly to clear the stinging whiskey from her eyes. Sitting alone in the darkest, most secluded booth near the back emergency exit was a man she had briefly noticed earlier in her shift. He hadn't ordered food, just a single, dark espresso that he barely touched. He wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim light, his dark hair threaded with striking, premature silver at the temples. His face was a study in hard angles and deep shadows, his jawline sharp, his eyes a cold, impenetrable storm cloud grey. He had an aura of absolute stillness, a coiled, dangerous energy that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. He looked like a predator observing prey. The slick-haired man turned, his forced bravado returning loudly. "Who the hell are you, buddy? Mind your own business. This is between me and the waitress." The man in the charcoal suit stood slowly. He didn't move fast. There was no rush to his actions, but every single step was deliberate and purposeful. He walked over to their table, his expensive leather shoes silent on the worn floorboards. The silence in the restaurant seemed to thicken, becoming almost suffocating with every passing second he drew closer. "My business," the man said smoothly, stopping mere inches from the slick-haired man, looming over him, "is ensuring that those who lack basic manners are taught them, very quickly and very permanently." He glanced at Eleanor, his assessing grey eyes sweeping over her whiskey-soaked uniform and the red mark on her wrist. There was absolutely no pity in his gaze, which Eleanor was grateful for. Instead, there was only a cold, terrifying calculation, as if he were adding up a debt. "Apologize to the lady," he ordered softly. The slick-haired man scoffed loudly, attempting to laugh it off, though he instinctively took half a step back, his body betraying his unease. "I ain't apologizing to her. She disrespected me. I'm the paying customer." "I see," the man in the suit murmured, almost to himself. He reached out with terrifying, impossible speed, grabbing the slick-haired man by the lapels of his expensive, custom-made suit and hauling him roughly out of the booth, lifting him almost onto his toes. The other three men at the table jumped up, shouting, but one single, chilling look from the grey-eyed stranger froze them instantly in their tracks, as if rooted to the floor. "You," the stranger said softly, turning his icy gaze back to the slick-haired man, whose face was now pale and contorted with genuine terror. "Are going to clean her uniform with your tongue, or I am going to teach you what real, agonizing disrespect feels like." The restaurant remained dead silent. Not even the clinking of glasses could be heard. Elena stood entirely frozen, the stinging in her eyes momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep awe as she watched the terrifying, absolute stillness of the man who had just intervened. Who was he? And why did the very air around him feel so violently dangerous? The tension in Luigi's trattoria was thick enough to choke on, a heavy, palpable weight pressing down on everyone in the room. The slick-haired man, previously so loud and arrogant, was now dangling from the stranger's grip like a discarded rag doll, whimpering softly. His bravado had entirely vanished, stripped away, and replaced by a stark, primal fear that caused his eyes to dart frantically around the room, seeking a rescue that wouldn't come. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean it. It was just a joke." The man in the charcoal suit released him abruptly, opening his hands as if dropping something dirty. The slick-haired man stumbled backward clumsily, colliding with his friends and nearly taking them down with him. "Get out," the stranger commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed with absolute finality through the silent room. "And if I ever see you in this neighborhood again, you won't leave it walking. Do you understand?" The four men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled frantically toward the door, pushing past each other in their haste, leaving their expensive coats and half-finished drinks abandoned behind them. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them with a definitive thud, and a collective, shuddering exhale rippled through the restaurant. Eleanor, still clutching the damp napkin she'd used to wipe her face, finally found her voice. It felt dry and tight in her throat. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice raspy from inhaling the alcohol fumes. The man slowly turned his gaze back to her. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, a stormy, turbulent grey that held a lifetime of dark secrets and unyielding control. He didn't smile. His expression remained carved from stone. Men like that only understand one language, Eleanor. Ignoring them only emboldens them. He reached gracefully into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a pristine, white linen handkerchief, folded perfectly. He held it out to her, an offering. "Use this." Elena hesitated. Taking something, anything, from a man who clearly commanded such raw, untamed power felt like crossing an invisible line she couldn't retreat from. It felt like accepting a debt. But the cheap whiskey was still burning her delicate skin, irritating her eyes. Reluctantly, she accepted the handkerchief, her fingers brushing against his very briefly. His skin was surprisingly warm and noticeably calloused, a stark contrast to his immaculate appearance. "Thank you," she mumbled, dabbing gently at her face. The fine linen smelled faintly of sandalwood, cedar, and something distinctly, aggressively expensive. "What is your full name?" he asked, his tone demanding an answer rather than requesting one. "Elena. Elena Moreau. Alessandro." He didn't offer a last name, nor did he offer his hand. "Take the rest of the night off, Elena. Go home. I can't afford to," she replied automatically, a sharp, defensive edge entering her voice. "Luigi needs me to close. If I leave now, I lose my tips for the night." Alessandro slowly glanced over at Luigi. The elderly, usually boisterous owner was currently cowering behind the brass cash register, his face a sickly pale color and his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Luigi wasn't looking at the spilled drinks or the mess on the floor. He was staring fixedly at Alessandro with a complex mixture of deep reverence and absolute, undeniable horror. "Luigi!" Alessandro called out, his tone perfectly even, carrying across the room without effort. "Miss Moreau is going home." Luigi nodded vigorously, his hands trembling visibly as they rested on the counter. "Si, Don Alessandro. Of course, right away." "Go, Elena. I will finish closing." "It is no problem." Elena stared at Luigi, deeply confused. Don Alessandro. The formal title sent a jolt of cold alarm straight through her. She knew the whispered rumors that floated around the West Loop, hushed stories of ancient families who ruled the city from the shadows, untouched by the law. She realized with a sinking feeling that she had just been defended by someone very, very dangerous. "My car is waiting outside," Alessandro said, turning his attention back to her. "My driver will ensure you get home safely." "No," Elena said firmly, instantly taking a protective step back. "Thank you for intervening. I appreciate it. But I'm fine. I can take the bus. I take it every night." A brief flicker of genuine surprise crossed Alessandro's stoic face, breaking his composed mask for just a fraction of a second. It was gone instantly, replaced by his usual blank stare. He clearly wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone in a damp, stained uniform. "The bus is not safe at this hour," he pointed out logically, his tone clipped. "It's significantly safer than getting into a dark car with a stranger, no matter how helpful they've been," Elena countered, her chin lifting defiantly as she met his intense gaze. Alessandro studied her for a long, silent moment. He saw the ugly whiskey stains ruining her uniform, the deep exhaustion carving lines into her face. But he also saw the unyielding strength and stubborn pride in her brown eyes. She wasn't intimidated by him, or if she was doing an extraordinarily excellent job of hiding it. "Very well," he finally conceded, his voice soft. He reached into his trouser pocket again, pulling out a thick, silver money clip. He efficiently peeled off several crisp, new $100 bills and placed them deliberately on the counter next to her abandoned tray. "For the ruined uniform. Buy a new one." "I don't want your money," Elena said quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "I can clean it." "It's not a request, Miss Moreau," Alessandro replied, his tone final and brokering no argument. He turned swiftly on his heel and walked toward the door. He paused briefly with his hand resting on the brass handle. "Be careful on the bus, Elena Moreau." He stepped out into the cold, rainy night, the heavy door clicking shut firmly behind him. Elena stood entirely alone in the quiet, tense restaurant, the rich scent of his sandalwood cologne lingering stubbornly over the sharp smell of cheap spilled whiskey. She looked down at the small fortune in money lying on the counter. It was more than she made in 2 weeks of grueling shifts. Her mother's mounting medical bills flashed relentlessly in her mind, a crushing, suffocating weight she simply couldn't escape. Reluctantly, hating herself slightly for it, she picked up the bills. As she did, she noticed something else. A small, heavy, embossed business card had slipped out of his pocket and lay half-hidden under a crumpled napkin. She picked it up cautiously. There was no name printed on it, only a stark phone number and a single, stylized, imposing V, stamped heavily in silver ink. Eleanor stared at the card, a cold shiver running rapidly down her spine. Who exactly was Alessandro Vitale, and why did she have the awful, sinking feeling that her previously ordinary life had just irrevocably, violently collided with his? The long bus ride home was a chaotic blur of neon lights smeared aggressively across rain-streaked windows, the city looking bruised and angry. Elena held Alessandro's handkerchief tightly in her coat pocket, the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood, a stark, luxurious contrast to the damp, metallic, stale smell of the late-night bus. She had spent the last hour desperately trying to convince herself that the violent encounter at Luigi's was a strange, entirely isolated incident. A very dangerous man had intervened, left some money, and that was the absolute end of it. Their paths would never cross again. Her apartment, a cramped, drafty one-bedroom in a faded, crumbling brick building on the far south side, was deeply quiet when she finally unlocked the deadbolt and slipped inside. Her mother, Marie, was asleep in the tiny, cramped bedroom, the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of her oxygen concentrator, the only sound in the small space. Elena walked quietly into the small kitchenette, turning on the single harsh overhead light. She pulled the crisp $100 bills from her pocket and smoothed them out flat on the chipped Formaker table. $500. It felt incredibly heavy, loaded with unspoken debt and potential strings. She hated taking it, hated the feeling of charity from a criminal, but pride was a luxury she simply couldn't afford when the pharmacy was actively threatening to cut off her mother's vital heart medications by the end of the week. She carefully placed the money in the worn manila envelope, clearly marked medical, then slowly pulled out the heavy business card with the silver V. She stared at it for a long, conflicted time before decisively tucking it into the back flap of her wallet. She would never use it. She couldn't afford to be indebted to a man who made seasoned, tough restaurant owners tremble with a single look. The next few days passed in an exhausting, mind-numbing blur of routine. Elena worked her quiet morning shifts at the city library, then rushed across town to Luigi's for the dinner rush, all while desperately managing her mother's increasingly demanding and complex care routine. She tried forcefully to push the memory of Alessandro's grey eyes to the back of her mind, but it lingered, unbidden, persistent, and strangely distracting. On Friday evening, the rare history section of the library was blessedly quiet. Elena was methodically shelving a stack of returned, heavy books, relishing the dusty, comforting silence. This was her element, surrounded by the tangible weight of the past, far removed from the chaotic, stressful reality of her present life. "Excuse me." The voice was quiet, incredibly respectful, and entirely unexpected in the deserted aisle. Elena turned sharply, a heavy, leather-bound tome of Renaissance architecture clutched protectively to her chest. Standing calmly at the end of the aisle was a man she didn't recognize. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, dressed immaculately in a sharp grey suit that looked out of place among the dusty shelves. He carried a rolled umbrella and an aura of quiet, brutal efficiency. "Are you Elena Moreau?" he asked politely, his tone pleasant but lacking warmth. "Yes," Elena replied cautiously, instinctively tightening her grip on the book as if it were a shield. "Can I help you find something?" "My name is Rossi," the man said, stepping one pace closer. "I work for Mr. Vitale." Elena's heart gave a sudden, violent lurch against her ribs. The name hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "I don't know anyone named Vitale. I believe you met him briefly on Tuesday evening," Rossi continued smoothly, his voice unhurried and confident. "At Luigi's trattoria. The incident with the unruly patrons." Elena felt a cold sweat break out quickly on the back of her neck. "I don't want any trouble, Mr. Rossi. I didn't see anything." "There is no trouble, Miss Moreau," Rossi assured her quickly, raising a hand placatingly. "Mr. Vitale was simply concerned about the incident. He wanted to ensure that those men haven't bothered you again since that night." "They haven't," Elena said, her voice tighter than she intended, betraying her fear. "Please tell him thank you for his concern, but it's entirely unnecessary." Rossi nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile briefly touching his thin lips. Mr. Vitale anticipated you might say exactly that. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and smoothly pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He held it out toward her. "What is that?" Elena asked, refusing to reach out and take it. "It is a business proposal," Rossi explained patiently, as if explaining something to a child. "Mr. Vitale currently requires someone with your specific academic background and skill set, an archivist and researcher. The compensation is extremely significant." Elena stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled, venomous snake. "Why me? There are hundreds of qualified researchers in Chicago. People with more experience. Because," Rossi said softly, his dark eyes steady on hers, unblinking, "Mr. Vitale was deeply impressed by your composure under immense pressure. He highly values discretion and intelligence above all else. He believes you possess both in abundance." Elena felt incredibly trapped. The tall shelves of the library suddenly seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. "I have 3 jobs and a very sick mother," she said, her voice rising slightly in panic. "I don't have the time or energy for a new job, especially one offered by a man who terrifies people into submission." Rossi didn't flinch or argue at her blunt, accusatory assessment. He simply placed the thick envelope carefully on the empty shelf space next to her. "The position is highly flexible. It can mostly be done from your home. And," he added, his voice dropping slightly to a conspiratorial whisper, "the compensation would easily and completely cover your mother's current and future medical expenses, including those expensive experimental treatments Dr. Harrison has been recommending." Elena froze completely. Dr. Harrison was her mother's private specialist. How did this strange man know about the highly experimental treatments she couldn't afford to even consider, let alone discuss publicly? The realization hit her with terrifying, paralyzing clarity. Alessandro Vitale had thoroughly investigated her. He knew everything about her desperate situation. "How do you know that?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently, with a potent mixture of violation, anger, and deep fear. Rossi tipped his head respectfully. "Mr. Vitale is incredibly thorough. He prefers to have all the facts laid out before making any investment." He turned to leave, his expensive shoes completely silent on the worn carpet. "The contact information is inside the envelope, Miss Moreau. We look forward to hearing from you very soon." Elena watched him walk away, leaving her entirely alone with the ominous cream-colored envelope. She didn't want to open it. She wanted to throw it away, to pretend it didn't exist. But the powerful words, "experimental treatments," echoed loudly, seductively in her mind. With violently trembling hands, she reached out and slowly picked up the envelope, terrified of the dangerous, shadowy world she felt herself stepping into, but even more terrified of what lengths she might be willing to go to save her dying mother. The discreet address on the card inside the heavy cream envelope led Eleanor to an imposing, deeply historic pre-war building nestled in the wealthy Gold Coast, miles away physically and economically from her cramped South Side apartment. The grand lobby was a hushed symphony of polished marble, gleaming brass, and quiet wealth, utterly intimidating in its opulence. She approached the mahogany concierge desk, her heart hammering violently against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt acutely, painfully out of place in her slightly worn trench coat and sensible scuffed shoes, acutely aware of the calculating stares of the staff. "Elena Moreau," she said softly, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I have a scheduled appointment." The concierge, an older man with sharp, discerning eyes, checked a leather-bound ledger and nodded respectfully, his demeanor instantly changing. "Ah, yes, Miss Moreau. We've been expecting you. The private elevator at the very end of the hall. It goes directly to the penthouse." The elevator ride was shockingly silent and swift, ending with a soft chime in a private, expansive foyer that opened directly into the largest, most breathtakingly beautiful apartment Elena had ever seen. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning, panoramic view of Lake Michigan, currently churning gray and restless under a heavy, overcast sky. The decor was meticulously minimalist, but exquisitely expensive. Dark, polished wood, supple leather, and striking abstract art that screamed wealth. But it wasn't the incredible view or the expensive art that held her attention. Alessandro Vitale stood completely still by the window, his broad back to her, staring out intensely at the turbulent water. He wore a simple, fine-gauge black turtleneck and sharply tailored dark trousers, yet without the suit jacket, he looked somehow even more raw and dangerous than he had at Luigi's. "You're remarkably prompt," he said, turning around slowly. His grey eyes swept over her instantly, assessing, yet remaining as unreadable as ever. "You left me very little choice," Elena replied, making a point of keeping her distance near the elevator. She clutched her battered purse defensively in front of her. "You actively invaded my privacy. You illegally looked into my mother's private medical records." Alessandro didn't bother to deny it. He didn't even blink. He walked over to a massive, imposing mahogany desk and casually gestured to an oversized leather chair opposite him. "Sit down, please." Elena stubbornly remained standing. "I'm not sitting until you tell me exactly what this is about. You want a researcher? Fine. I need the work." But why all the theatrics? Why the deep, invasive dive into my personal life? Alessandro leaned gracefully against the solid edge of the desk, crossing his strong arms over his chest. "I absolutely do not do business with people I don't fully know, Elena. It is a necessary precaution. Your mother's illness is your greatest vulnerability. It makes you desperate, and desperate people can be easily manipulated or bought by my enemies." "So you're manipulating me before they can?" She shot back, hot anger quickly flushing her cheeks. "No," he said softly, shaking his head slightly. "I'm eliminating the vulnerability entirely. The compensation I'm offering completely removes your financial desperation. It ensures that when you work for me, you are entirely focused, clear-headed, and deeply loyal. Your mother's mounting bills are completely paid. The experimental treatment is secured and scheduled." Elena felt the very ground shift terrifyingly beneath her feet. He had already paid them. "You can't just do that. You can't just swoop in and buy my life." "I haven't bought your life," Alessandro replied smoothly, his tone reasonable. "I've simply purchased your expertise at a premium. The rest is simply ensuring my investment yields the best possible results without distraction." He moved deliberately away from the desk and walked toward a heavy, reinforced oak door situated at the far end of the expansive room. "Come here, please." Hesitantly, drawn by a mixture of deep apprehension and professional curiosity, Elena followed him. He unlocked the heavy door with a brass key and pushed it open, revealing a room that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. It was a library, but not like any modern facility she had ever seen. The tall walls were lined entirely with floor-to-ceiling custom shelves, tightly packed with thousands of ancient, leather-bound volumes, rolled scrolls, and delicate, crumbling maps. It smelled strongly, intoxicatingly of old paper, dry dust, and centuries of secrets. "My family has collected information for many centuries," Alessandro said, his voice lowering with a rare, genuine hint of reverence as he surveyed the room. "Journals, detailed ledgers, territory maps, private correspondence. Some of it dates back to Renaissance Italy. The vast majority of it is entirely uncatalogued, unread for generations, and rapidly decaying." Elena stepped fully inside, her burning anger momentarily eclipsed by sheer, profound professional awe. She walked slowly to the nearest shelf, her fingers hovering reverently over a thick spine bound in cracked, aged vellum. "This is incredible. This room is an archivist's wildest dream. It's a complete mess," Alessandro corrected her flatly. "I need it meticulously organized, accurately translated, and digitally preserved. I need to know exactly what is in here. Specifically, I am actively looking for anything related to a massive property in Sicily acquired by my great-grandfather in 1922. Elena looked at him, slowly comprehending the staggering scope of the job he was offering. "You want me to single-handedly sift through decades, perhaps centuries, of your family history." "Centuries," he corrected firmly, "and it requires absolute, unbreakable discretion. The information contained in this room, it is highly sensitive, potentially dangerous in the wrong hands." "Is that the real reason why you chose me?" she asked quietly, turning to face him. "Because I'm a nobody? Because if I try to talk, no one will ever listen or believe me?" Alessandro stepped closer, the familiar, intoxicating scent of sandalwood quickly wrapping around her. He looked down at her, his expression suddenly intense and piercing. "I chose you because you stubbornly stood your ground when an angry man threw whiskey in your face. I chose you because you proudly refused my money when you clearly, desperately needed it. You possess integrity, Elena. In my dark world, that is the rarest, most valuable commodity of all." He reached out and handed her a small, heavy brass key. "This key is yours. You work in here entirely on your own schedule. Rossi will handle your generous payroll and communicate directly with your mother's doctors." Elena looked down at the cold key resting in her palm. It was a tangible, heavy link to a dark world she didn't understand, to a dangerous man she instinctively knew she should fear. "And what if I find something deeply unsettling?" she asked, her voice hushed. "You inevitably will," Alessandro replied bluntly, holding her gaze. "You are researching the Vitale family history. We certainly did not build our vast empire by singing in a church choir." He paused, his grey eyes darkening like a storm front. "But you will not judge it. You will only catalogue it. That is the job." He turned sharply and walked back toward the main office, leaving the door open behind him. "Start whenever you're ready." Elena stood entirely alone in the quiet, dusty, magnificent archive. She held the key tight, her knuckles white, knowing that turning the lock on this door meant opening a door in her own life that could never, ever be closed again. Months slowly bled into a comforting, predictable rhythm of old paper, translation dictionaries, and quiet, solitary discovery. Elena spent her days deeply immersed in the Vitale archive, completely surrounded by the lingering ghosts of Alessandro's violent ancestors. She rapidly learned their sprawling, chaotic, often bloody history, a complex tapestry woven with unbridled ambition, shocking betrayal, sudden unimaginable wealth, and an undeniable, chilling ruthlessness. She meticulously organized thick ledgers filled with cryptic, coded transactions, painstaking, translated, faded, brittle Italian letters detailing brutal, multi-generational family feuds, and carefully, lovingly restored huge maps of territories long since fought over and violently claimed. The challenging work was fascinating, intellectually demanding, and blessedly far removed from the constant stress and grease of Luigi's trattoria, which she had thankfully finally quit. More importantly, her mother's failing health had miraculously stabilized. The crushing, suffocating weight of the medical debt had been instantly lifted by Rossi's quiet, incredibly efficient monthly payments. Elena felt a confusing, daily mix of immense, profound gratitude and deep, twisting unease. She was being handsomely paid by a known crime syndicate to preserve their dark history. She was complicit, even if tangentially, in their world. Alessandro himself rarely visited the archive. When he did, it was usually very late at night, long after the rest of the city slept. He would stand quietly in the doorway, hands in his pockets, watching her work under the glow of her desk lamp, asking brief, highly pointed questions about her daily progress. These brief encounters were always charged with a heavy, unspoken tension. He was an intimidating, imposing presence. Yet, to her dismay, Elena found herself eagerly anticipating those quiet, late-night visits. One stormy, miserable Tuesday evening, torrential rain lashed aggressively against the thick penthouse windows. Elena was hunched closely over a particularly fragile, water-damaged journal belonging to Lorenzo Vitale, Alessandro's infamous grandfather. The handwriting was erratic, a furious, nearly illegible scrawl detailing a vicious, bloody dispute over port control in the late 1950s. "You're squinting terribly." Elena started violently, nearly dropping her heavy magnifying glass. Alessandro was standing silently in the doorway, shedding a soaking wet overcoat. He looked incredibly tired, the lines around his mouth carved deeper than usual, a dark shadow of heavy stubble darkening his strong jawline. "The handwriting is exceptionally difficult," Elena said quickly, trying to calm her racing heart and steady her breathing. Lorenzo was clearly not known for his excellent penmanship. Alessandro walked slowly into the room, pulling a heavy leather chair opposite her desk. He didn't sit down immediately, instead leaning over her desk to look at the open journal. He wasn't known for his patience, either. He smelled strongly of rain, cold night air, and his ever-present sandalwood cologne. But underneath it all, Eleanor suddenly caught a sharp, metallic scent that made her stomach clench with fear. Blood. She looked at him closely, her eyes tracing the harsh line of his jaw down to his unbuttoned collar. There was a faint, distinct, dark smear on the edge of his crisp white shirt, stark against the fabric. "You're hurt," she said, the concerned words slipping out before she could stop them. Alessandro glanced down dismissively, a brief flicker of irritation crossing his weary face. "It's nothing. A very minor disagreement that got out of hand." "Disagreements don't usually involve blood," Elena pointed out firmly, her voice surprisingly steady given her racing heart. "Unless, of course, you're a Vitale." He looked up at her, his grey eyes narrowing slightly in surprise. It was the absolute first time she had openly, directly acknowledged the violent reality of his world. "You are very observant, Elena. It's my job," she replied calmly, gesturing broadly to the piles of papers covering her desk. "I observe things people actively try to hide." Alessandro finally sat down heavily, running a tired hand through his damp, dark hair. He looked utterly exhausted, a rare, startling crack in his impenetrable, terrifying armor. "Some things are infinitely better left hidden entirely. Like the bloody port dispute of 1956? She asked quietly, tapping the open journal. "It seems your grandfather had a nasty habit of resolving arguments by simply removing the obstacle entirely." Alessandro sighed, a harsh, weary sound that echoed in the quiet room. "My grandfather was a brutal, unforgiving man in a brutally unforgiving time. I am actively trying to be different from him." "Are you?" Elena challenged softly. She knew she shouldn't be pushing him. She knew it was incredibly dangerous. But the sight of fresh blood on his shirt, combined with the deep exhaustion in his eyes, sparked something reckless and protective inside her. "You command fear just as easily and effectively as he did." Alessandro met her gaze squarely, and for a fleeting moment, the cold, calculating Don vanished entirely. He simply looked trapped. Fear is a necessary tool. Sometimes, in my world, it's the only one that works. If I show even a hint of weakness, my family is instantly destroyed. It's a heavy, suffocating mantle, Elena. I didn't ask for it, but I wear it to survive. He looked away, staring bleakly at the endless rows of ancient books. I foolishly thought bringing you here would help me understand where we came from, perhaps help me find a way out of the endless cycle. But all I see in these damn books is violence, endlessly begetting violence. Elena felt a sudden, sharp pang of genuine empathy for him. Beneath the terrifying, ruthless exterior was a man suffocating slowly under the crushing weight of his violent legacy. "It's not all violence," she said gently, reaching across the wide desk and pulling a different, much smaller journal from a neat stack. "This belonged to your grandmother, Isabella. It's full of family recipes, beautiful poetry, and deeply loving letters to your grandfather." Alessandro looked surprised, his posture shifting. "Isabella? She died long before I was born. I know very little about her." Elena carefully opened the small book, the brittle pages crinkling softly. She loved him very much. She wrote constantly about his hidden kindness, his quiet, gentle moments. She saw a very different side of him that isn't recorded in these bloody ledgers. She slid the small book gently across the desk toward him. Alessandro stared at it for a long, agonizing time, his large hand hovering over the delicate pages, seemingly afraid to even touch it, as if his touch might ruin it. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick and rough with unspoken emotion. He stood up abruptly, the brief moment of shocking vulnerability passing as quickly as it had arrived. "It's very late. You should go home, Elena. The driver is waiting downstairs." Elena nodded, slowly gathering her things. She walked toward the heavy door, then paused, turning back to look at him. He was still standing frozen by the desk, staring down intently at his grandmother's journal. "Alessandro," she said softly into the quiet room. He looked up quickly, visibly surprised by her casual use of his first name. "You're not your grandfather," she said firmly. "You have a choice in how your own history is written. It doesn't have to end in blood." She didn't wait for a response, stepping quickly out into the quiet, pristine foyer. But as the sleek elevator doors slid closed, she knew with terrifying certainty that the invisible, rigid lines between them, employer and employee, Mafia boss and archivist, had irrevocably blurred, and the real danger was no longer just hidden in the past she was cataloguing, but in the volatile present she was rapidly becoming a part of. The quiet archive had quickly become Eleanor's primary sanctuary, a silent, dusty bubble entirely separate from the loud, messy realities of her life. But the comforting quiet was violently shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena was carefully, painstakingly unrolling a fragile, crumbling map of 19th century Palermo when the heavy oak door of the archive swung open with a resounding bang that echoed like a gunshot. She jumped violently, nearly tearing the brittle parchment in her hands. It wasn't Alessandro. A man stood aggressively in the doorway, noticeably younger than Alessandro, maybe early 30s. He wore a loud, ostentatious, pinstriped suit that screamed expensive but terrible taste. His dark hair was heavily slicked back, and his smile was sharp and predatory, completely lacking any genuine warmth. He held a lit, foul-smelling cigar, the acrid smoke immediately invading the musty, controlled air of the room. "Well, well, well," the man drawled loudly, stepping fully into the room and looking around with obvious disdain. "Sandro's little pet project. I thought he was joking when he said he hired a pretty little librarian to dust his books." Elena stood up quickly, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "Who are you? You shouldn't be in here. This area is restricted." The man chuckled, a harsh, grating sound that set her teeth on edge. He walked arrogantly toward her desk, ashes falling carelessly onto the polished hardwood floor. "I'm Marco Vitale, Sandro's cousin, which means sweetheart. I can go wherever I damn well please in this family's territory. And this is my territory." He stopped abruptly at her desk, leaning aggressively over to inspect the delicate map she was holding. He smelled heavily of expensive, cloying cologne, stale smoke, and something distinctly, unnervingly dangerous. "Fascinating," Marco sneered dismissively, blowing a thick cloud of foul smoke directly into her face. "Dust and old, useless paper. Sandro is obsessed with the dead past because he's rapidly losing control of the very real present." Elena coughed slightly, stepping back, utterly disgusted by his intrusion and his complete lack of respect. "Mr. Vitale is certainly not losing control, and this room is strictly off-limits to anyone but him and myself. I must ask you to leave immediately." Marco's dark eyes darkened further, the playful cruelty vanishing entirely. "You've got quite a mouth on you, don't you? I heard you were some tough little waitress he picked up from the gutter. Looks like the rumors were true." He reached out suddenly, his hand grabbing roughly at a neat stack of newly translated, highly sensitive letters. "Don't touch those," Elena snapped aggressively, her fierce, protective instinct for the delicate documents completely overriding her very real fear. She reached out instinctively and grabbed his wrist hard, just as she had done with the abusive patron at Luigi's months ago. Marco froze entirely, staring incredulously at her hand, holding his wrist as if she were a diseased insect that had landed on him. A thick muscle in his jaw twitched violently. Slowly, deliberately, he grabbed her forearm with his free hand, his grip crushing, tight enough to instantly bruise the skin. "Listen to me very carefully, you little nobody," he hissed venomously, leaning in so close she could feel his foul breath. "You think because Sandro pays you well, you're somehow untouchable? You're absolutely nothing. You're just a hired hand dusting off his pathetic vanity project. I could break you." Eleanor struggled fiercely, but he was far too strong. Cold panic flared sharply in her chest. "Let me go." "I don't think I will just yet," Marco whispered nastily, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her throat. "I think I want to see exactly what Sandro finds so interesting about you." "Let her go, Marco." The voice was ice-cold, completely devoid of any inflection, yet it carried a lethal, undeniable promise of violence. Elena and Marco both turned instantly toward the doorway. Alessandro stood there. He wasn't wearing his usual suit jacket. His crisp white sleeves were rolled up, revealing strongly muscled, heavily scarred forearms. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, terrifyingly empty, a deep stillness radiating from him that was far more frightening than rage. Marco immediately released Elena's arm, stepping back quickly with a forced, highly nervous laugh. "Sandro, hey, just visiting, just officially meeting the new help." Alessandro walked slowly into the room. He didn't even look at Marco. He looked only at Elena. "Are you all right?" he asked very quietly. Elena rubbed her aching forearm, her voice shaking slightly, despite her best efforts to remain strong. "I'm fine. He came in uninvited and started handling the documents." Alessandro finally turned his cold gaze to his sweating cousin. "Get out!" "Come on, Sandro," Marco pleaded, raising his hands quickly in a placating, defensive gesture. "It was just a joke. Don't be so overly sensitive. We have much bigger problems right now. The Russians are pressing hard on the South Side distribution." "I said," Alessandro interrupted smoothly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. Get out of this room before I throw you out the window." Marco hesitated, the false bravado slipping entirely to reveal genuine, naked fear. He looked fearfully at Alessandro, then at Elena, an ugly sneer twisting his features. "Fine. But you can't hide in here forever, Sandro. Playing with old books while the real family business burns to the ground." He turned and practically fled the room in terror, his heavy footsteps echoing frantically down the long hall. A heavy silence descended on the archive, fraught and uncomfortable. The foul smell of Marco's cheap cigar lingered heavily, tainting the usually pleasant air. Alessandro stood motionless for a long, agonizing moment, his hands clenched so tightly into fists at his sides that his knuckles were white. He took a slow, deep breath, seeming to physically force the murderous tension out of his rigid body. He turned back to Elena, his stormy grey eyes dark with a complex emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "He hurt you." "I'm fine," Elena repeated firmly, refusing to let him see how badly shaken she truly was. "It's just a bruise. It's not a big deal at all." Alessandro closed the distance between them quickly, stopping just inches away from her. He reached out slowly, his large, calloused fingers gently tracing the angry red marks already forming on her arm where Marco had grabbed her. His touch was incredibly light, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the brutal violence he had just barely restrained. "It is a very big deal," he murmured, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "He blatantly disrespected my territory, and more importantly, he disrespected you." Eleanor looked up at him, her breath catching softly. The raw intensity in his gaze was completely overwhelming. He wasn't looking at her as an employee or even an archivist. He was looking at her with a fierce, terrifying protectiveness that she had never experienced before. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she whispered, completely unable to look away from his gaze. Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He slowly, reluctantly dropped his hand, taking a step back. The impenetrable mask of the Don slid back into place, though the jagged cracks were now clearly visible. "Take the rest of the week off, Elena," he said, turning away from her and looking blindly at the shelves. "Rossi will arrange a secure car to take you to a safe location. You are absolutely not safe here right now." Elena frowned deeply, confusion warring fiercely with alarm. A secure location? Why? What did Marco mean about the Russians? Alessandro stopped at the heavy door, glancing back over his broad shoulder. His expression was incredibly grim. Marco is a complete fool, but he is right about one thing. The violent present is rapidly catching up with me, and I absolutely will not let you become collateral damage in my war. He walked out quickly, leaving Elena entirely alone in the archive, realizing with a heavy, sinking heart that the quiet history she had been safely studying had finally, violently ignited the volatile present. The secure location was a sprawling, heavily fortified, isolated cabin hidden deep in the dense Wisconsin woods. Rossi had driven her there in complete, oppressive silence, a heavy black, armored SUV, navigating winding dirt roads for hours until they reached the heavily gated, hidden property. It was stunningly beautiful, completely surrounded by ancient, towering pines, but Eleanor felt exactly like a prisoner trapped in a gilded cage. 3 very long days passed in agonizing slowness. Elena paced the beautiful hardwood floors restlessly, completely unable to concentrate on the few books she had hastily brought. She worried constantly about her mother, though Rossi had repeatedly assured her she was being closely monitored by a private, heavily armed security detail at the hospital. She worried about the precious archive left abandoned and unprotected. But mostly, terrifyingly, she worried incessantly about Alessandro. He had vanished completely back into the dark, violent underworld he ruled, The news was completely silent, a deliberate media blackout that only fueled Elena's growing anxiety. On the fourth evening, a brutal, violent thunderstorm rolled in, heavy thunder shaking the very foundations of the sturdy cabin. The power flickered erratically and died, plunging the house into deep darkness, save for the sudden, bright flashes of lightning. Elena sat huddled on the massive leather sofa, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, staring blankly into the cold, dark fireplace. The isolation was oppressive and terrifying. Suddenly, the heavy, reinforced front door opened violently, letting in a gust of cold, wet, angry air. Elena jumped up, her heart hammering frantically. The armed security detail Rossi had left was stationed outside. They had strict orders not to enter without knocking. A tall, broad figure stood unsteadily in the doorway, darkly silhouetted by a massive crack of lightning. "It's me," a very rough, pained voice said. "Alessandro." He pushed the heavy door shut and leaned heavily against it, gasping. Even in the dim, flashing light, Elena could clearly see he looked terrible. He was soaked completely through, his usually immaculate, expensive suit entirely ruined, and he moved with a stiff, unnatural, painful awkwardness. Elena hurried toward him, frantically grabbing a heavy flashlight from the side table. As the bright beam hit him, she gasped loudly in horror. His face was badly bruised, a nasty, jagged cut torn open over his left eyebrow, but it was his side that drew her horrified, disbelieving gaze. He was clutching his ribs tightly, his hand dark and slick with wet blood. "Alessandro, my God, you're hurt." He tried weakly to wave her away, wincing sharply in pain as he did. "It's nothing. Just a graze." "That is definitely not a graze," Elena said firmly, her initial fear entirely replaced by a sudden, practical urgency. "Sit down. Now." She practically dragged him to the sofa, forcing him to sit. He groaned loudly, leaning his head back, his eyes tightly shut in agony. The intimidating mask of the Don was completely gone. He was just a severely wounded, exhausted man. Elena ran frantically to the kitchen, grabbing the extensive, well-stocked first aid kit she had found earlier, along with clean white towels and several bottles of water. She returned quickly, kneeling beside him on the floor. "I need to see it," she said, her hands hovering nervously over his ruined, bloody shirt. Alessandro opened his eyes slowly, looking down at her with a complex mixture of intense pain and something much softer, almost apologetic. "You really shouldn't have to deal with this, Elena." "I am dealing with it," she said flatly, brooking no argument. She carefully, painfully unbuttoned his shirt, peeling the sticky fabric away from the ugly wound. It was a bullet graze, nasty, jagged, and bleeding sluggishly, tearing deeply through the flesh of his side. It wasn't deep enough to be immediately fatal, but it desperately needed cleaning and stitching. "I have to clean this immediately," she warned him, pouring harsh antiseptic onto a clean towel. "It's going to hurt, a lot." He didn't even flinch as she pressed the fiercely stinging cloth to his torn side. He just watched her intently, his grey eyes intensely focused on her pale face in the dim beam of the flashlight. "Why are you here?" she asked softly as she worked, desperately trying to distract him from the pain. "Shouldn't you be with your private doctor?" "I couldn't trust anyone else right now," he admitted, his voice tight with pain and exhaustion. Marco betrayed me completely. He actively allied with the Russians. They tried to take me out." Elena's busy hands stilled for a fraction of a second. The arrogant, obnoxious cousin had actually orchestrated a hit. Did you? "The threat is entirely neutralized," Alessandro said, a sudden, terrifying, cold hardness returning to his tone. It was a chilling, absolute confirmation that Marco was very likely dead. Elena resumed cleaning the wound, her hands trembling slightly now. She was actively patching up a killer, a ruthless mob boss. Yet, looking closely at the deep exhaustion lining his face, she couldn't bring herself to pull away or run. "You're shaking," he observed very softly. "I'm not exactly used to treating bullet wounds," she deflected quickly, actively avoiding his intense gaze. She pulled out a curved needle and thick suture thread from the kit. "I have to close this. I've seen it done on my mother. But I'm not a doctor." "Do it," he instructed simply. It was a grueling, tense 10 minutes. Elena focused entirely on the delicate task, forcefully shutting out exactly who he was and what terrible things he had done. When she finally tied the last tight knot and securely taped a heavy bandage over the wound, she fell back on her heels, completely exhausted. Alessandro let out a long, shaky breath, resting his head back heavily against the leather sofa. "Thank you." Elena sat on the floor beside him, pulling her knees tightly to her chest for comfort. The violent storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows. "You can't keep living like this, Alessandro. You'll end up dead, just like your grandfather." He looked down at her, the dark shadows deep in his face. "I told you, there is no way out. The Vitale name is a cage. There is always a choice," Elena argued, her voice rising with sudden, fierce passion. "You have vast resources, incredible intelligence. You could carefully dismantle it. You could walk away. And leave my entire family to be brutally slaughtered by the rivals I've held off for years," he countered bitterly. "Leave the innocent people who depend on me, like Rossi, like Luigi, like you." Elena looked up at him, genuinely surprised. "I don't depend on you. I work for you." Alessandro reached down slowly, his large fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His warm touch sent a powerful jolt of electricity straight through her. "Don't you understand, Elena?" he murmured, his voice dangerously soft and filled with emotion. "You are the only reason I am trying to survive this." The heavy confession hung thickly in the quiet, dark room, heavier than the raging storm outside, leaving Elena completely breathless and deeply terrified of exactly what it meant. The air in the cabin shifted radically after Alessandro's confession. It was incredibly heavy, highly charged with a sudden intimacy Elena wasn't at all prepared for. He hadn't just admitted to caring for her. He had placed the massive weight of his continued survival directly on her shoulders. For the next 2 days, the storm continued to rage fiercely outside, perfectly mirroring the intense turmoil within the cabin. Alessandro healed remarkably fast, a stark testament to his hardened, brutal lifestyle. Elena tended carefully to his wound, the necessary physical proximity forcing a quiet, highly dangerous familiarity between them. They talked for hours, not about the Mafia or the violence, but about the ancient books in the archive, about her mother's brief, passionate stint as a painter, about his secretly harbored love for complex classical piano. He was highly intelligent, surprisingly, dryly funny, and deeply, inherently guarded. Elena realized with a terrifying, absolute clarity that she was rapidly falling for the complex man hidden beneath the monster's skin. On the third bright morning, the storm finally broke, leaving a crisp, exceptionally clear blue sky. Rossi arrived promptly, his face an unreadable professional mask, carrying a heavy, secure metal briefcase. Alessandro met him in the main living room. Elena hovered nervously near the kitchen, instantly sensing a radical shift in the atmosphere. The quiet, intimate interlude was officially over. The dawn had returned. "The volatile situation in the city is entirely stabilized," Rossi reported efficiently, his voice low and serious. "The Russians have fully retreated. Marco's splinter faction has completely surrendered or permanently disbanded. And the legitimate assets? Alessandro asked, his voice returning to that cold, commanding tone she remembered. Fully secured, Rossi replied. He carefully placed the metal briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with a satisfying click. Inside were thick stacks of complex legal documents and a single, ancient-looking, heavily worn leather-bound ledger. Elena gasped softly from the kitchen doorway. She instantly recognized that specific ledger. It was the only item in the entire archive she hadn't been allowed to even touch. Alessandro had kept it, securely locked in his private desk. Alessandro immediately noticed her reaction. He gestured for her to come closer. Elena, please sit. Hesitantly, she moved slowly to the sofa, sitting opposite him. Rossi stepped back respectfully, his hands folded neatly. Alessandro slowly picked up the old ledger. It looked entirely out of place against the crisp, modern legal documents. This, he said, tapping the cracked leather cover, is the true, dark Vitale legacy. Not the violence, not the vast territory. This is the ledger of sins. He opened it carefully. It wasn't a record of money, but a highly detailed, horrifyingly meticulous account of massive favors, brutal blackmail, bribes, and deep leverage the Vitale family held over powerful politicians, high-ranking judges, and rival families, dating back over 70 bloody years. With this small book, Alessandro explained quietly, his eyes dark, my grandfather easily controlled the entire city. With this, I maintain the fragile peace. It is the only thing keeping the wolves actively at bay. Elena felt physically sick to her stomach. Why are you showing this terrible thing to me? Because, Alessandro said, looking at her with an intense heat that burned, I am destroying it. Today, Rossi shifted slightly, the absolute only sign of his profound shock. Don Alessandro, without the ledger, we lose all leverage entirely. We will be completely vulnerable to attack. We will be entirely clean, Alessandro corrected him sharply. He turned back fully to Elena. You told me I had a choice. You told me I could dismantle it. You were right. He picked up a sleek, heavy black lighter from the table. I have spent the last agonizing month secretly transferring all our legitimate assets into secure, blind trusts, aggressively dissolving the illegal operations, and generously paying off those who wanted out peacefully. The war with Marco forced my hand earlier than I planned, but it is officially done. Elena stared at him, utterly stunned. You dismantled your entire empire? For me? For myself, he corrected gently, though his intense grey eyes told a very different story. Because looking at you, looking at the honest, hard, but real life you lead, made me violently realize how entirely hollow my power truly was. I don't want to be a ghost, haunting my own archive, Elena. He flicked the heavy lighter. A small, bright flame danced between them. He held it resolutely to the corner of the ancient ledger. Wait! Rossi interjected desperately, his voice tight with panic. There are vital names in there. Proof of massive corruption. If you destroy it, you lose all your protection. But if you give it to the authorities... If I give it to the authorities, I spend the rest of my natural life rotting in a federal prison, Alessandro replied calmly. And my family name is dragged brutally through the mud for another decade. No, it ends in ashes. He let the hot flame catch the brittle paper. He quickly dropped the burning book onto the heavy metal tray Rossi had brought. The dry, aged paper caught quickly, thick smoke rapidly filling the room with the acrid, heavy smell of burning history. They watched in completely stunned silence as 70 years of blackmail and blood slowly turned to ash When the fire completely died down, Alessandro looked at Rossi. "Your massive severance has been fully wired, Rossi. You are officially a free man." Rossi nodded very slowly, a rare look of deep emotion crossing his stoic face. "It has been an absolute honor, Alessandro." He turned and left the cabin without another single word. Alessandro turned fully to Elena. He looked significantly lighter, as if a massive physical weight had been suddenly lifted from his broad shoulders. But there was also a stark, new vulnerability in his grey eyes. He had aggressively burned his bridges, entirely destroyed his armor. "I am no longer Don Vitale," he said very quietly. "I am just a man with a lot of legitimate money and a very, very complicated past." He reached out slowly, taking her trembling hands firmly in his. "I don't expect you to magically forgive who I was, but I am asking if you will give me a real chance to show you exactly who I want to be." Elena looked at the smouldering ashes of the dark ledger, then up at the man who had deliberately burned his entire world to the ground just to start over. She squeezed his warm hands, her heart pounding with a terrifying, incredibly exhilarating hope. "I suppose," she whispered, a small smile touching her lips, "I can help you write a completely new history." The transition to a normal life wasn't easy. The sudden massive power vacuum in Chicago's underworld inevitably caused ripples of violence and chaos, but without the rigid Vitale structure to support it, it was highly disorganized and eventually burnt itself out. The FBI, deeply confused by the sudden, complete disappearance of the city's most elusive, powerful target, launched several massive investigations that ultimately went absolutely nowhere. The hard evidence, the leverage, the damning ledger, all of it was completely gone. 6 quiet months later, Elena stood happily on the wide balcony of a beautiful, sun-drenched historic villa in Tuscany. The warm air smelled heavily of cypress, lavender, and warm earth, a stark, beautiful contrast to the damp, metallic scent of Chicago. She held a cold glass of iced tea, watching fondly as Alessandro walked up the long gravel path. He wore simple, comfortable linen trousers and a loose white shirt, his sleeves casually rolled up. He looked completely relaxed, the harsh, deep lines of tension completely smoothed from his face. He was laughing warmly, enthusiastically tossing a stick for a scruffy, energetic stray dog they had adopted a month ago. He truly wasn't Don Vitale anymore. He was just Alessandro. He looked up quickly and saw her, his bright smile widening. He jogged up the stone steps, pulling her instantly into a warm, tight embrace, burying his face deeply in her neck. "The head architect says the extensive restoration on the old winery will be entirely finished by spring," he murmured against her warm skin. Elena smiled, leaning happily into his strong embrace. "Good, because I've already meticulously catalogued the entire history of the vineyard, and I'm very ready to start drinking the profits." They had entirely relocated to Italy, using the vast, legitimate funds Alessandro had secured to buy and lovingly restore a beautiful, ruined vineyard. Elena's mother, Marie, was living with them, her fragile health vastly improved by the warm climate and the world-class medical care Alessandro had permanently arranged for her. She was currently inside the massive kitchen, happily terrorizing the local chef with her strong opinions on proper tomato sauce. It wasn't a perfect, flawless fairy tale. Alessandro still occasionally had terrible nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, fighting the dark ghosts of his violent past. And Elena still sometimes looked at his large hands, so calloused and strong, and remembered exactly what they were terrifyingly capable of. But they were actively building something new together. Something honest and real. Later that quiet evening, after Marie had finally gone to bed, they sat together by the crackling fire in the newly renovated library. It wasn't the dark, highly intimidating archive of Chicago. This beautiful room was bright, filled with modern literature, poetry, and huge art books. Alessandro sat comfortably in an armchair, reading quietly, while Eleanor worked diligently at a small, beautiful desk, efficiently organizing the large estate's complex finances. She looked over at him affectionately, the warm firelight catching the distinguished silver at his temples. "I was thinking," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Alessandro immediately lowered his book, giving her his full, undivided attention. "About what exactly?" "About the massive archive we left in Chicago," she said, gently tapping her pen against the desk. "All those journals, the history of your family before they ever came to America, before all the violence started." Alessandro's relaxed expression tightened slightly, a dark shadow quickly passing over his grey eyes. "What about it?" "It absolutely shouldn't be lost," Elena said firmly. "I want to fully finish translating it. Not the bloody ledger, not the records of the crimes, but the beautiful letters between your grandparents, the old recipes, the powerful story of a family just trying to survive." Alessandro was completely silent for a very long time. He looked deeply into the fire, the ghosts of his past visibly flickering in the flames. Finally, he looked back at her, a profound, deep gratitude shining in his grey eyes. "You really, truly believe it's worth saving?" he asked very quietly. "I believe," Elena said, getting up slowly and walking over to him, "that we have to fully remember exactly where we came from, so we are careful not to repeat the exact same mistakes." She sat comfortably on the arm of his chair, resting her hand gently on his strong shoulder. "And I firmly believe your grandmother's limoncello recipe is a vital historical artifact that absolutely needs to be shared with the world." Alessandro let out a sudden, loud, genuine laugh. He pulled her down happily into his lap, wrapping his strong arms securely around her. "Then we will definitely save it," he promised, gently kissing the top of her head. Together. He had willingly thrown away a massive empire, burned his dark legacy to ash, and walked entirely away from unimaginable power. But holding Elena securely in the quiet warmth of their beautiful new life, Alessandro Vitale knew he had finally found the absolutely only thing truly worth keeping. Thank you so much for deeply listening to The Waitress and the Don. I truly hope you enjoyed this emotional journey of redemption, hidden strength, and the incredible power of choosing a better path. Alessandro and Elena's complex story reminds us that our dark past doesn't have to permanently dictate our future, and that true strength often lies in deep vulnerability and the immense courage to change. If you enjoyed this emotional storytelling experience, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment sharing your favorite part, and subscribing to the channel for more original, cinematic stories. Your ongoing support allows me to keep creating new worlds and amazing characters for us to explore together. Until the next story, take care.